Welcome, everybody. We are so excited to see so many folks on the line with us today to hear more about our new report that we are releasing today. We are really thrilled to be releasing today with a whole host of amazing partners that we will go over in just a minute. We see this as one agenda to move us forward toward identifying systemic racism in our system and identifying concrete policy actions across levels of government that can help us build more equitable systems that work for all of our kids. This new report builds on a report that we released earlier this year over the summer with the Bipartisan Policy Center that reviews 3 core kind of equity areas in the early ed space. This report that we are releasing today is broader than that and gets at many more parts of the system. And we hope can be transformative in pushing us forward in this space. We see it as a common agenda that we can get behind. Not the only agenda. It's not an exhaustive list of policies. It's not an exhaustive list of priorities. Certainly there are many others, but it is a list of actual policies that will help move us closer. And that's what we hope to do today with all of our partners and with advocates and stakeholders and parents and families and providers across the country. Janiko, if you can go to the next slide, please. So I want to start by acknowledging the work and effort that was put in by all of the authors and co-authors on this paper. We had folks from across the country who are part of the Children's Equity Project Network come together to write this report. Next slide, please. And we were so thrilled to be releasing it in partnership with a number of national organizations that are really leaders in our field, including the National Black Child Development Institute, the Council for Professional Recognition, the Education Trust, the Equity Research Action Coalition, NACI, the National Head Start Association, the BUILD Initiative, and NICA, the National Indian Child Care Association. Next slide, please. So before we jump in, we did want to kind of frame the conversation and kind of talk through how we thought about equity and how we think about equitable systems. And I'm just going to read this. This is from part of the report. We define this as equitable learning systems providing access to resources and opportunities, 1, to positive experience to children and families, 2, that 3, result in positive outcomes that are not associated with children's demographic characteristics. They actively and continuously identify and intentionally eliminate manifestations of systemic racism and other forms of oppression. So with that framing, I am going to hand it over for a few opening remarks to one of my friends and colleagues and co-authors on this report, Don Yazzie, who is a early childhood mental health consultant on the Navajo Nation and also part of the Center of Excellence for Infant and Early Childhood Mental Health Consultation at Georgetown University. Don?
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. I've got internet connectivity issues here on the reservation, so hopefully I stay, I guess, audible throughout the whole time today. I just wanted to thank you for the brief introduction there, Chantal. And as you shared, I do have a clinical background in mental health. And right now, I do not do direct clinical work, but I do indirect work on the Navajo Nation, also some time with the Center of Excellence for Infant and Early Childhood Mental Health Consultation. And I provide support to tribes who have I-Launch grants. And just wanted to preface this today that there are over 570 federally recognized tribes, and there's many more that are not recognized federally or by states. And I don't attempt to speak for all tribes, but there are commonalities that many tribes have faced and have gone through and have strength today to be here today in this modern world. And I just wanted to also preface that I truly believe that Indigenous peoples, of the world before colonization have perfected the most advanced early childhood systems that included family, that included spirituality, that included nature, that includes multi-levels of generations of families who all taught and were a part of raising children and truly believed in connectedness and relationships. And we know in the field of early childhood that attachment and relationships and connecting is how children grow and learn. So I just wanted to preface that, and that's the frame that I come from in talking about and with my colleagues today and with this policy. And fast forward to 500 years in this country today, and thinking about how we bring together today's modern policies and also bring forth and honor the thousands and thousands of years of knowledge that our people have around early childhood, around the importance of planning for young children before they're born, the ceremonies and prayers that we know and have, and the intentionality behind all of those teachings and practices, and to recapture them and bring them forth and honor them. So that's what I just wanted to share with everyone today in relation to supporting tribes in this work of building equitable systems. Thank you.
So now I'm going to hand it over to my partner and co-author in this report, Dr. Ioma Iruka, for some opening remarks before we jump in.
Thank you so much, Chantal, and thank you to everybody who is out there, and obviously the co-authors and the national organizations. Again, I feel like Dawn really set the stage by telling us and reminding us that to get to equity, we have to recognize the expertise and the brilliance that exists in our system, and before that, and the oppression that has made a lot of marginalized communities' experience and expertise invisible. And so I say I stand here with all my partners, but also in recognition that I stand on so many shoulders, and I am honored to be here to engage in this report release and the work. Really, this is the beginning of a much larger work that I am so thrilled that we have started already, and I think will continue. So thank you, and look forward to the conversation.
All right, let's jump into the report. Next slide, please. So we're going to go through and talk through each of the 14 priorities and then skim through some of the recommendations in the report, but not all of them. So we encourage folks to check out the full report for everything. The first priority, which is probably not surprising and is the biggest one here, is disseminating public funds equitably, which has not ever been done. I also want to preface us jumping in by saying that none of these can work on its own. None of these on its own is gonna solve inequities in our system. They all hang together, and they have to be implemented together, and they have to be worked on together. And we can't take, we have to prioritize over time, and we might have to stagger them, but none of them stands alone. They all hang together. So I do want to, make sure we have that in mind. And then the second thing to have in mind, this paper is bringing together equity priorities and the current levers of government and systems that we operate in now. So they are things that could be done now, could be done tomorrow by Congress, by federal agencies, by states and tribes. At the same time, we recognize the need to re-envision a new system altogether and to rebuild a new system altogether. But we feel that a both and approach, where we figure out what we can do now and today in these systems now, while we concurrently plan for the future and re-envision what new systems could look like, is critical to really look at both. So disseminating public funds equitably. For this recommendation, we really look at and reflected on that for most of American history, all of American history, resources have been disseminated on the basis of race, with white folks being advantaged and Black folks and people of color and Indigenous folks being disadvantaged in access to resources. And we still live with that today. We know that there are studies and there's research that finds that schools that have more students of color are less resourced and have fewer per pupil spending than those schools that are whiter. And we know that trickles down across our system. So for this particular recommendation, we talk about establishing and working on figuring out equitable funding formulas that take all of these things into account, take historical marginalization, including on the basis of race, into account, take into account disparities, current disparities in access to resources, take into account access to quality experiences and disparities in outcomes that we see. You know, today we have several programs and initiatives and funding models that are kind of needs-based, but we narrowly define that as income and ignore the historic marginalization that has happened over time on the basis of race and other factors. And so we think that we need to consider that and incorporate that when we develop funding models and funding formulas across systems. The second piece is we have a whole number of targeted programs that were developed to provide resources to historically underserved and marginalized communities. We have Head Start, we have Title I and Title III of ESSA programs. We have all of the IDEA programs. And all of them have been chronically underfunded and aren't even close to meeting the need of what we need to really kind of equitably kind of have funding formulas. So fully funding those programs. At the federal agency level, beginning to require applicants and prioritizing applicants for federal funding that include data on resource disparities in the community and describe how they're going to close those resource disparities, which necessarily requires giving more resources and equitably funding to the places that have been historically underinvested in. At the state and tribal level, similar type of thing. And you'll see that some of these kind of nest, you know, some require congressional action, but some states can also move on, right? So considering historical, again, and current marginalization in how states and tribes allocate and distribute resources, we think is equally important. Next slide, please.
So I would say, you know, the next was really around the moving towards a more holistic, strength-based and authentic integration, right? We are becoming much more of a segregated communities, and we see this reflected in early childhood. And we also know that, you know, integration did not fully happen, and there's a lot of pain and trauma still resonating from that. And a lot of that was heaped on sort of Black bodies. And so with this, we're really talking about how do we sort of do it in an authentic, integrated way. Again, I think as Chantal has already articulated, thinking about both the historical and contemporary inequities that exist. And so for Congress, right, funding a targeted and universal approach to early childhood, incentivizing holistic and strength-based authentic integration. Again, not just moving bodies, like Black people to white communities, but really a lot of pieces, including funding. You know, like on the federal side, is to, you know, prioritize applicants who have a plan for true socioeconomic and racial integration, and also provide an issue guidance and TA on funding models that really combine state, federal, tribal, and local funds to really maximize inclusive and supportive settings. And then of course for states and tribes, you know, is to develop plans to really increase, again, this authentic integration. Again, I think we want to emphasize the authentic integration that's not just about moving bodies, but about integrating, whether it's funding, workforce, to really make sure that we're not sort of creating sort of this hierarchy of inequities. Next slide, please.
So the next piece is embedding equity in monitoring and accountability systems. Our first report that we released over the summer, Start with Equity from the Early Years to the Early Grades, did a really deep dive on the data, state of the research, state of the policy landscape on, you know, 3 different areas: inclusion of kids with disabilities, harsh discipline, and inequitable access to learning, bilingual learning opportunities for DLLs. And a common theme that we found throughout is that equity is just almost completely lacking in all monitoring and accountability systems, or it's woefully inadequate where it is. And if we're not holding folks accountable for equitable resource distribution, for equitable outcomes, for equitable experiences, we're not going to get them. You know, I think one thing that has just kind of recently come to light, the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights released the latest round of civil rights data collection about 6 weeks ago or something like that. And what we found was that there was a sharp drop in preschool suspensions, which is great. but the racial disparities remained almost intact, as they have been every time this data is released every couple years. And so what we think about there is, there's been a lot of talk about discipline, for example, just as one example that we'll talk about more later, but not so much tied to closing disparities in discipline and then monitoring and holding folks accountable when there are big disparities and clear bias in the system of discipline. So just one example. So in terms of what we can do about this and how we embed this in monitoring and accountability, Congress should request GAO reports annually on equitable access to these three things, right? To quality programming, quality experiences, and disparities in outcomes, and then direct the appropriate departments, whether it's education, whether it's HHS, whether it's BIE, to address those inequities and figure out how we move past those and bridge those. Looking at federal agencies, states, and tribes at every level, right? Because the federal government monitors states or local programs. In the case of Head Start, states monitor local education agencies and other programs at the local level. So across all of these levels, we have to embed equity indicators into monitoring, into accountability, because until we do, and until we kind of tie that to funding or losing funding, we're not going to get to where we want to go. Next slide, please. So in the report, just as a follow-up to that, I'm not going to read all of these, but we kind of work together to identify what indicators could look like, what indicators we could incorporate into monitoring, into quality rating systems, which we'll get to in a minute, into standards. And I think this is our attempt, like this whole paper, to operationalize equity into these different parts of the system and how we embed it into the different parts of the system. So I'd invite you all to take a look at that. And again, the caveat that this list is by no means exhaustive, but we think it begins, it gives us a number of examples to pull from so we can begin to do this work concretely. Next slide, please.
So, I think, when you put all this into sort of put it all together, the workforce is such an important sort of linchpin to a lot of this, right? And we know the early care education workforce is replete with a lot of inequities. When we examine it by race, setting type, job position, we don't, we've had many reports, including the National Academy's report around transforming the workforce. And we know that there's disparities, racial disparities specifically in pay and benefits. When we think about compensation, and we know those actually have life consequences, right? Whether you have benefits or determine whether you stayed home, right? Whether you're able to stay home during COVID. And we know certain members of the early child community was able to stay home as we are still being ravaged by COVID-19. And some actually have to be operating their businesses in order to get money. So we know there's a huge level of workforce disparities. And so part of what we're trying to do is really make sure that as we sort of re-envision or transform in whatever way the early childhood sector, that we think about the workforce and how we sort of create a bifurcated, workforce with the haves and the have-nots. And so part of this that, we're calling for in our report is for Congress, right? We have to increase funding for CCDBG and Head Start, including, the travel set-asides, to really be able to use funding to actually increase the workforce compensation. We know from our data, our current data now, that we are losing a lot of members in the workforce because of COVID-19, as well as businesses. So we actually have to figure something out in terms of compensation and maintain it at least the level that we had, pre-COVID. And as we continue to figure out sort of the compensation, it's always the competency issues. And so, we're also calling for a new grant program that provides pathways for paraprofessionals and others who are not teachers and, credentialed teachers, especially those who are bilingual staff and other staffs of color, to be able to attain their credentials, including higher education credentials, so that they can become lead teachers. A lot of them do lead teacher work, do not get the affirmation or the pay for it. And so how do we make sure that they have the opportunity to do that without obviously saddling with a lot of debt that which we know is crushing many families and people of color? And for federal agencies, it's, begin to require pay parity at a minimum, really at a minimum, right? Again, this is based on science that says that there's a lot more needs to be done in terms of ensuring that children have the best start in life, especially the first few years of life. And so we have to make sure our workforce is strong and stable. And so being able to sort of require a minimum in parity with K-12 could be what we should at least start with, regardless of the age group the teachers that are being taught. And that's really important, right? We can't sort of say, yeah, 3s and 4s, but not the infants and toddlers. It requires states to track, report, right? Develop plans, like real plans that they can be held accountable for to address any of the racial and other disparities in compensation and access to supports. And of course, for states and tribes, right, to increase the value of childcare subsidies. We know right now the subsidies do not pay the full rate of the highest quality that is available. And so how do we begin to make sure that we incentivize that? And of course, we track and develop. To me, part of this report is calling on not just saying, oh, do something, but actually holding people accountable, holding agencies accountable, and holding providers accountable, but obviously with pay as well. Next slide, please.
So, Matak spoke to this a little bit, but kind of part and parcel with that is really working to embed equity in workforce preparation and development. And that includes through higher ed, through credentialing, through other licensing systems, and that includes in-service professional development. We need to do a much, much, much better job of incorporating these issues into and recognizing them as essential base knowledge to work with children and families. So for this particular recommendation, we talk about funding dedicated and targeted equity TA across the early learning through the early grades. We need a more targeted approach to making sure this is embedded in those systems. Using executive actions to require workforce racial equity training and coaching for all ECE providers, which is a bit of a market departure from where we've been in this previous administration. Funding, and the other piece that we talked a lot about is figuring out quality control in terms of racial equity training and figuring out how to assess what types of racial equity training are effective in attitude and behavior change. And so really working to fund some research on what that looks like and give guidance for that. At the state and tribal level, ensuring, again, racial equity training is content or coursework is required as part of any state licensing or credentialing system for early ed, starting from entry-level credentials, including the CDA, or a state-level credential, all the way up to graduate level degrees. Again, the content on the history of the construction of race in this country and racism, and bringing that forth to how that manifests in our systems today and what it looks like in the classroom and how we can combat that and provide more equitable experiences for kids is, again, should be required baseline just alongside understanding child development. Both of those we can't separate them all. And again, looking at our coaching infrastructure, at our PD infrastructure, at the folks who are coaching our teachers and childcare providers and providing PD, and ensuring that they are equipped, because whether you're an inclusion coach or a quality coach or a literacy coach or a mental health consultant or a pyramid model coach or whatever else, this should be part of their job too. This is everybody's job. And so if you're coaching on inclusion of kids with disabilities, you should also have the racial literacy and understand and have those skills to be able to look at those intersections and incorporate that in part of your work. Next slide, please.
So, the sixth one is really about explicitly including equity in a definition of quality in across rated systems. This is one of my favorite topics. I have many favorite topics. This is one of them. And the reason why, right, is because I think in many ways, as somebody who, as part of the research core, I would say members who have engaged in collaborating on quality rate improvement systems, we know that the concept of quality drives resources and funding in early care education. It determines basically who is high quality, who is not, right? It's written into regulations and written into legislations, and it has funding attached to it. And these sort of things kind of where we can explicitly see where, issues of racism and bias comes through. And so, but however, indicators of equity are not actually in the quality rate improvement systems, whether through equitable experiences or equitable outcomes. They really have not been in the system. And I take a little pause to say that while we sort of are clearly noting some areas where early child can do better, there are things that we know is happening, right? Like we do know there's a deeper examination around many other things we're noting, including quality improvement system, where there has been some beginning conversation around how do we make sure that equity is explicit in something like the quality improvement system, because it does impact a lot of early care education programs, regardless of type or age group. And so, but to ensure that it actually truly happens, right? Congress, we need to ensure that, Congress has to ensure that any articulation of quality standards in any form is explicit in terms of how equity is integrated as an indicator of quality, right? Like to me, could you have high quality without thinking about equity in this fullest of forms, especially as how we define it in the report? And for federal agencies, right, ensuring that any federal funding for QRIS requires states to articulate how is equity integrated in all aspects of your indicator, right? Whether from your standards to your rating tools, right, to your TA, whatever is in your quality rating improvement system or your quality initiatives, how is equity in that part of it, in all pieces of it? And similarly with states and tribes, right, ensure that their QRIS and similar quality initiatives include equity indicators, right, whether it's and provide specific funding to support, programs provided to meet those indicators. And this is especially important for our historically marginalized communities, and programs that have historically had less access to systemic resources. I think that's a piece that's an undercurrent in this report, that we have to think about funding and resources, not just about contemporary inequities, but historical inequities. Next slide, please.
So the next one, you got a quick glance of my cute nephew there in that previous photo, but the next one is ensuring high quality curricula and pedagogy are accessible and culturally responsive. This is a big one, and the right to a child-centered, developmentally appropriate, play-based, culturally and linguistically responsive, pedagogy and curricula, we think that that's a right, and that all kids should equitably have access to that. And that is just not the case today. In too many cases, these models that we call optimal, in some cases ideal learning approaches, aren't equitably accessible to all kids. And we think that is such an important part of where the rubber hits the road of what happens in the classroom that needs to be looked at. So for this one, federal agencies funding research that identifies the most effective, of course, culturally and linguistically responsive, but also scalable pedagogical approaches and curriculum. Developing and piloting measurement tools or sets of tools that assess equitable learning opportunities. So this is a big one too, right? We got to it a little bit before, and we'll talk a little bit later on. But how do we measure who is getting what within the classroom? And Ioma just spoke to kind of QRIS, and we have a section on measurement later on. But if you are rated a 5 classroom or a 6 classroom on the class, how do we make sure that each individual child is getting a 5 or a 6 experience, right? Based on whatever the classroom is, and how do we ensure that there's equitable access to that pedagogy and to that curriculum and to those experiences and relationships with teachers? For states and tribes, providing targeted TA to expand access to these approaches across the system, right? Across the pre-K, across childcare in all forms, and prioritizing historically marginalized communities in those TA efforts. Next slide, please.
And so connected to what Chantal just said about measurement, right? Again, measurement is expensive, it takes time. But we do know that it's really important, especially to have an equitable system, right? So, and our most widely used global classroom quality measures, which include the classroom assessment scoring system, obviously that's regulated in Head Start, and the environment rating scale, right? These tools really have been important for our field and still are, right? They've given us sort of the sign that have shown the importance of examining enriching opportunities. The quality of teacher-child interactions matter, and the structure and learning supports really matter for children. So they have given us a really important foundation. And so we have to really honor their value to our system. Unfortunately, though, these observation measurements, while valid and reliable, are limited in their intention to incorporate issues of equity in relationship and interactions and experiences, and don't really measure any level of bias in any form. And so it's really important, right, that as we sort of move forward into what is, a transformation of early childhood, that any of our tools really, we begin to at least examine, are there other tools that can ensure that equity really is centered in what we consider quality practices. And so with that in mind, Congress, we say, should, in all upcoming early child related legislation, ensure that any requirements related to global classroom quality measurement really include an explicit measurement of equity indicators, or even an equity frame, equity tool, right? We need to make sure that all our measures really capture that, to really fully ensure that children have equitable experiences and outcomes as well. And the federal agencies really should fund new research, right, to identify, adapt, and develop feasible, valid, and reliable measurement tools that capture equity. Again, I should say, that I am a co-author of a measure around, classroom quality with an equity focus. And I want to remind us, it is a hard work. It is a lot of time. And so, but it's important. If we think equity is important, then we need to invest the time and the energy. And then states and tribes should ensure that equity measurement at the program or the classroom level explicitly incorporates, is explicitly incorporated into any state or tribal funding or monitoring measures that are equitable and focus on equity, whether it's through QRIS or other means. Next slide, please.
So eliminating harsh discipline. I'm going to run through these. We're going to run through these last few because I know we're running a little short on time, but would invite you again to read the full report. So we have talked about this one, and we have focused on this one a lot over the past several years. There has been a whole wave of policy action from the federal government to states, to local communities, to individual districts and schools on this particular issue. I will reiterate to what I said at the beginning, and when I kind of cited the example of the new data. We have had, unfortunately, too much of a colorblind approach to addressing harsh discipline. And the vast majority of state legislation that has actually passed limiting harsh discipline in young children has ignored altogether the disparity and just focused generally on reducing the rates or on limiting the practice. And the result has been that we have seen decreases in the rate, but we have not seen any budge in that disparity. And so we need a much more targeted and specific approach across all the levers of government, right? Across monitoring and accountability, we need to be looking at disparities, not just at outcomes in this particular issue. Across TA, again, not just focused on positive discipline generally, but on the disparity and what it is that is maintaining that disparity wide and stubbornly there, regardless of what we do to promote social emotional development and mental health consultation. We need a more targeted approach to actually getting rid of the disparity. And that is true across research, across TA, across policy that we need to focus on. So I am going to go to the next slide. We're a little short on time.
So with this one, it's really about, addressing equities in early intervention and special education, because we obviously have, know the full history about children of color less likely to be represented, particularly in certain spaces of early intervention, special ed. And so really asking to fully fund IDEA and, included parts B and C. And so it's increasing funding to allow for more of that accountability and monitoring and placement of children across both Congress doing it and federal agencies, ensuring that all IDEA data is reported, including outcome data and disaggregation, again, an important part, by race and disability as well. Next slide, please.
So we know data is so important when it comes to equity and when it comes to civil rights enforcement. We have talked a lot as a field about continuous quality improvement and being data-driven and embedding data into professional development. We have not talked as much about how we embed equity into that cycle and into that system. And so this particular recommendation tries to move us from just generally talking about continuous quality improvement to talking about a data-driven continuous equity quality improvement cycle, where all data are disaggregated, where we don't look at outcomes in aggregate, we look at outcomes, and disparities in outcomes, and we embed that information, and in particular, where we're seeing disparities, into professional development that is specifically targeted at bias, at racism, at closing those, what is causing those disparities. Next slide, please.
And then, of course, children are part of systems, AKA the family. And so families, we know, are children's first, primary, and long-lasting teachers. Their funds of knowledge, their culture foundation matters for children development. Unfortunately, the early care education system is really challenged with meeting the needs of families, especially families of color, families from linguistically diverse backgrounds, immigrant families, and families with children with disabilities. And this is problematic. And we're seeing that even much more now with COVID-19. Which has clearly upended a part of our early care education system. And so really calling for Congress to really promote more family governance and really meaningful and culturally grounded and responsive family engagement across the early child system. And this is because we also need federal agencies to really collect more meaningful data, which means we need more research really to develop, measurement tools that meaningfully capture the effectiveness of family engagement and support, and really brings family voices and true participation and culture in the space. And that also means the same thing for states and tribes to ensure that, all state and needs assessments across ECS systems include data about family strengths and react and act upon those. Next slide, please.
So centering family childcare. I think we all know that family childcare gets a lot less attention and has less access to resources than center-based care, particularly when we think about policymaking. And that just in any equity agenda, I think this needs to be centered, and we need to focus on this and ensure also equitable access to resources to family childcare providers and the kids who are in their care, many of whom are kids from historically marginalized communities. So for this particular, when we looking at states and tribes, ensuring family childcare and other ECE home-based providers, including family friend and neighbor, are included in needs assessment, in workforce development, in TA efforts, and really receive equitable supports. We talked about this a little in the QRIS, but equitable supports, equitable, not equal, to access the QRIS and move up the levels of the system of QRIS. We talk a little bit about using childcare quality funding to develop and grow family childcare networks, which we know are really important, and in particular can be a great and important tool to expand access to comprehensive services for kids. And prioritizing building family childcare supply and networks in childcare deserts in particular. And kind of at the federal level, really looking and ensuring that TA explicitly includes family childcare, and including and strongly encouraging the inclusion of FCC providers in the early Head Start childcare partnerships and in any expansion of the early Head Start childcare partnerships that we see. Next slide, please.
And then the last, obviously, but not the least, is really this equitable expanded access to dual language immersion approaches. We know dual language learners make up about a third of young children, and it's a growing number, and most of them speak Spanish at home. And they're diverse in many ways. And, although we have this growing bilingual learning models, they're actually not reaching the children who actually benefit and need them the most. And so really asking for Congress to really invest in building capacity for actually expanding dual language immersion opportunities for our youngest learners, as well as invest in the workforce, and provide alternative certification programs to increase the supply of qualified bilingual early child educators. And of course, accessing data, adding data to actually as part of the civil rights data collection, and obviously adopting standards that really incorporate holding states and tribal communities accountable to ensure that dual language learners actually access these opportunities for their education and their language. And so with that, I wanted to kind of get into the panel. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it back to Chantal to introduce them.
So we can go ahead and stop sharing the screen, and all of our partners can turn on their cameras to get this panel started. So I'm going to do a really brief round of introductions, and then Dr. Iruka is going to throw out the first question. So first, we are so excited and pleased to have Dr. Seema James, who is the interim CEO and president of the National Black Child Development Institute, Dr. Calvin Moore, who is the interim CEO and president for the Council of Professional Recognition and oversees the CDA credential. Tommy Sheridan, who is the deputy director of the National Head Start Association. Lauren Hogan, who is the managing director for policy and professional advancement at the National Association for the Education of Young Children. Dr. Carrie Gillespie, who is the senior analyst on P12 policy at the Education Trust, and Jennifer Ratcliffe, who is the executive director of the National Indian Child Care Association. My partners Don Yazzie and Ioma Iruka are going to co-moderate the panel with us, and I'm going to hand it to Ioma to throw out the first question.
Awesome. Well, so glad that you guys can now hear other people than us. So to our amazing panel, right? Tell each of you, please tell us about you and your organization and how the policies in this report align with your approach to equity. Who's the first one that we're going to, Chantal?
Let's go to Dr. Calvin Moore.
Perfect.
Thank you, Chantel, and let me congratulate you and the Children's Equity Project on this wonderful report. I'm Calvin Moore. I'm the CEO of the Council for Professional Recognition, and I've been doing some deep reflection on this report, and I think my being here on this panel with the rest of my colleagues is a testament to the fact that not only have we had some success in this equity movement, but that we have so much more work to do. Council for Professional Recognition promotes the continued improvement in terms of performance and the recognition of early childhood professionals working with children birth to age 5. And as I embrace the work of the Children's Equity Project around these important policies and priorities, I just want to say that at the council, we've been grappling with what does it mean when an individual receives the Child Development Associate credential. And I think these priorities and the way they're articulated today really help us grapple with that question in ways that we haven't before, because we believe that the work that we're doing here at the council is to make sure that early childhood professionals always have alternative pathways to demonstrating competencies and their work with children in a way that others can understand. And I think that that's how this report really aligns deeply with our work. We have to have career ladders and career opportunities for those working in Black and Brown communities, and it must be articulated in a way that they can embrace and that others can also embrace the competencies that they are demonstrating every day with children and families. And so I'm proud to be here with my other colleagues and listen to how this important document will also impact their work with children and families as well.
Tommy, do you want to jump in next?
Absolutely, and again, just to reiterate what Dr. Moore said, just congrats. I think this is a long time coming. I remember the first conversation that Chantel, Lauren Hogan, and I had about something like this. Chantel's probably talking to many people at the same time, but the first conversation the three of us had together. And the question was, is there any interest? Is there any ability? Would people be interested? And I think both Lauren and I were like, you don't need to say a single more word. Absolutely. This must be part of our goals. This must be deeply ingrained in every single thing that we do. As early childhood advocates, and especially early childhood professionals who are focusing on at-risk populations, whether that is children and families in poverty, children and families with special needs, children who come from Black, Indigenous, or other people of color communities. And those are things that we must continue to do more, because frankly, we haven't done enough. And I think that this report really reiterates a lot of various topics and things that we can really do to improve on the work that we're doing. Our approach at National Head Start Association is that equity is not the end goal, but more so equity is the vehicle to drive continuous improvement towards the end goal of breaking down systemic racism. Right, and that is ultimately the way that this report, I think, very clearly outlines, is that we have a lot of work to do. We're not going to accomplish it overnight, but there are steps that we can take to get there. We also believe that Head Start is intrinsically an anti-racist program in that it improves access to opportunity for children and families from low-income backgrounds who are disproportionately Black, Indigenous, and other persons of color. We believe that Head Start does have a critical role in contributing to a more equitable future, and the community's commitment to anti-racism must be an unceasing, intentional, and urgent focus of our work. And so we believe that it's our job to help contribute to that. So excited to be here today, and again, excited for so many people to be joining us to see really a pathway to the future.
Jennifer, you want to jump in next?
Sure. Thank you all for the opportunity to be a part of this conversation. In the work that we do, we are so marginalized in this conversation that we often don't even get invited to the table with recognition that people understand how tribal people need to be included, but we just don't know where to start. So at our organization, the National Indian Child Care Association, we work with all early care and education programs across the country, particularly childcare, but also work very closely with our Head Start partners across the country. A lot of the work that we focus on is really that equitable distribution of resources. And I think throughout the past several years, and especially during COVID, we've really seen that kind of come to fruition. With the engagement in, an effort like this is also helping that come to fruition. And I think, one of the things that really stands out to us is just how important it is to include that tribal voice, because it's such a unique perspective, and people are coming from just a different space often. There's so much often the question of where do we even start to engage tribal communities? And I think one of the things I want to make sure to share today is the first place to go to if you don't have a connection in the community itself is start with the tribal council, and all of that information from tribes in your area is available online, and usually pretty accessible to find contact information. But in our efforts, one of the kind of biggest barriers for everything is just the remoteness of our communities and the rurality of our communities. And COVID really highlighted that. And in one of the places is simply broadband access. And we don't really promote, television for little kids, but how it comes out to play in, ensuring the development of our professionals who are teaching these kids. It also comes into play in engaging when we're in a situation like we're in now in the pandemic. So there's so many steps we have to take to make sure that we are engaging tribal communities in these conversations. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I have so much more to say, but I will stop there and let other people also contribute. Thank you so much.
Dr. James, do you want to jump in?
Sure, thank you so much. So MBCDI, our mission is to improve and advance the quality of life for Black children and families through education and advocacy. And the point that's already been made about breaking down institutional racism is really where MBCDI aligns with this report. We are about addressing the impacts of oppression. The disparities we see for Black children and families are not of any failing of Black children and families, but a failing of our systems and an impacts of oppression. And so seeing in this group that we're having that conversation about institutional racism is exactly the reason why we're at the table. This report hits the nail on the head in that it addresses three themes that I always think of when I'm thinking about this work: equity, diversity, and quality. We have to ensure that we can have quality, but if every child doesn't have access to it, then we are creating issues in our system. If our definition of a highly qualified workforce doesn't mean that that workforce is diverse, doesn't mean that that workforce has been prepared to address their own racial bias, then we are failing our children. And so for me, those themes are core and they are throughout the report. And we're just happy to be a partner because of that alignment.
Lauren, do you want to jump in next?
Sure, thanks, Chantel. You know what? We're going to go with Dr. Meek this now and forever. So I want to start off with how you just recognizing the sort of both and approach of what we can do now while we're envisioning this new future, because I think that's another way of saying, you know, some of these steps they're necessary, but they're not sufficient. And I think other folks have spoken to that as well. And I think that was one of the things that was so encouraging to me, to NACI, about the process and the report. It's really alignment with our work and the recent position statement on advancing equity in early childhood education, which was co-created and supported by at least several of the folks I can see on my screen, including affiliates who I know are here and others. You know, I would say, I think to Dr. James's point, workforce equity is clearly sort of an interest of, you know, particular interest for NACI. We're a professional membership organization. We took the position in the Advancing Equity Statement that it is the professional obligation of all early childhood educators across settings, across states, across age bands to advance equity. And that in order to do that, to effectively do that work, it requires the equitable treatment of early childhood educators themselves as well, again, across all settings, including family childcare. We have to build this recognized early childhood education system with sufficient sustainable financing, ensuring all members are receiving equitable compensation and professional recognition that reflects the incredibly complex and value of their work. I would just add that I think one of the ways that we've worked to address sort of this question of anti-racism and equity within early childhood education at NACI, in everything from sort of our policy formation and our advocacy and our outreach work, has been to increasingly sort of expect ourselves to, and frankly, to hold ourselves accountable for, centering and reflecting the lived experiences and the expertise of those who comprise the profession itself, and sort of confronting the marginalization of educators in decision-making processes, rooted in just decades of the racism and elitism that's internal and external to our field. But we have this significant gap between practice and policy and whose voices get centered, whose voices get to make the decision. So bridging that gap is, I think, where we align and where we see a lot of this impacted, and everything from QRIS and licensing, which was brought up here, to Jennifer's point about sort of how we think about issues of broadband as issues of equity and access for early childhood educators, to issues of our own accreditation system. So I think there's a ton of really important alignment, and we're just really excited to be part of it, to be thinking about the specificity for moving equity forward.
Carrie, why don't you jump in?
Hi, thanks so much. I too am really excited to be here, see this report out into the world. So I work at the Education Trust, and my focus there is on early childhood education. And the Ed Trust is a national nonprofit, and it works to close opportunity gaps that disproportionately affect students of color and students from low-income families, really through two ways: research and advocacy. And so this report echoes our approach to our work, in that we like to analyze every policy and every dollar through this single lens of what is right for children of color and children from low-income families. And what I really appreciate about this report is how concrete it is about the responsibility of federal and state and local people in power to make policies more equitable. As Chantel said, Dr. Meek said, these are things that could be done tomorrow if we had the political will. So I really see that as echoing Ed Trust's work. Our work in early childhood is really focused on increasing equitable quality and access and diversity of the workforce, and also better data to monitor all of this. And part of the way we do this is through partnerships with advocates across the country who do amazing work. And this report is one of those reports that will be actually so very useful and concrete for giving steps to take for specific asks to policymakers. And as Lauren touched on just now, I really appreciate how this report emphasizes the need for including in the policymaking process those that are most impacted by the policies from the very beginning, really centering those perspectives as key inputs. And finally, I'd just say, as we all know, long throughout history, early care and education has been heavily informed by systemic racism and ableism, and has oppressed and marginalized people of color. And I appreciate how much this report centers that, and it's well past time that our field and our nation centers that and calls it out and has a concrete set of actions we can take, like those in the report.
Dawn, if you're there, I think you're still there. I think you're gonna throw out the next question. All right, I might jump in and throw out one and see if Dawn can rejoin us in a second.
Can you
Oh,
hear
there
me
you
now?
are. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, my kicking on and off here, and I gotta remember to push star 6. So next question will just, be for all of our partners here. With this report and thinking about it, how do you guys see this as a way to reach out to and partner kind of across the lane, so to speak, that tribal set-aside funding has created with anything early childhood or home visiting or FFN or kith and kin? How do you see this report as a way to reach across and, reach out to whether it's the National Indian Head Start Directors Association and National Head Start Association, all the way down the line? How do you all see that happening?
And I might call on folks since there's so many. So Dr. James, do you want to kick us off on this one?
Sure. So making sure I'm not muted. So thinking about that question, how we, and let me make sure I understand it, Dawn, it's making sure that how do we use the report to engage with people that we aren't even usually partnering with, who also care about equity, who want to see the work moving forward? What opportunities for partnership do we see based on this report?
Yes, based on this report. And of course, we know the report goes with all other policies.
So what I noted in the report, and I don't want to say too much echoing what Lauren said, but I do believe that the next step of this report, the most important next step, would be partnering with our local communities and those on the ground. So for me, I think about not just external partners and other organizations, but our national affiliate network at the National Black Child Development Institute, ensuring that we're walking them through this report, that we're identifying the top priorities that they would have and want to promote at the local level, that they're engaging in conversations with families. So for me, the first steps I have in mind are about our community level partners. And I think our other national partners would agree, we have to have the voices of the community behind these policies that are focused on equity, because we have to know that at the point of implementation, that they're going to be implemented in a way that advances equity. And in order to really ensure that, we have to have the voices of our families.
Dr. Moore?
Thank you, Dr. Meek. I think I would just add to what Dr. James said. And as I think about the report, I think about the conceptual framework that's needed. And I think that's what's present here in the report, because you've organized the ideas in a way that really drives further conversation. And I think for me, reaching out to other stakeholders who might also share my paradigm around equity, I would think that the report does that for leaders in our field and those who are impacted by the work. And so as I look at the report and I think about the ideas that are organized here, I think they're easy to remember and then apply, which makes it easy for us to advocate for change. But I think the report itself drives those in the field to have conversations with people that you might have little conversations with before. And I'm thinking about those stakeholders, even in the CDA community, that sometimes gets lost in these kinds of conversations, like family childcare providers and family friend and neighbor care providers and folks that we know are underserved. And so I think the report is a great vehicle to drive some of that conversation.
I'm going to see if one more person wants to chime in on this one, because we're running a little short on time and want to get to that last question. So anybody else want to jump in on this question?
I would love to, if I can, real quick. Is just I think that this is highlighting an issue that I think is so critical that really stuck out at me, and this actually came up to me just a day or 2 days ago over the weekend when I was reading the final report one more time and just kind of reflecting on it a bit. One of the things that really stuck out to me is how often throughout American history we have allowed the role of federalism to perpetuate systemic and institutional racism. And I believe that that has taken place in the early childhood space, just as it has in so many other communities. And I think what's really critical about this, and one of the things that I loved about this report, is that we recognize that effective solutions are driven on the federal level by setting high standard and setting kind of a common goal or a common vision, but then empowering folks on the local level. And really recognizing the unique relationship that the federal government has with tribal entities, by recognizing that in some communities it absolutely makes sense to do things one way. It might make sense to do things a totally different way in a different community, but allowing kind of that local decision making to set that in motion is critical. Whether we're talking about an urban community in one state, or we're talking about a migrant and seasonal community in another. And I really think that is one thing that we can take from this, is to hold ourselves accountable, hold our elected leaders accountable, to not say, well, we can't do this because it's not the role of the federal government. Or it's the role of the state, or it's the role of so-and-so. I think that's critical. And I think this report recognizes everybody has to be part of this. And everybody must be part of this for us to actually see us make the progress we think we need to make.
Thank you all. So I'm going to throw out the last question. I would love everyone to answer it. And we'll go in order again. But what are your concrete steps? As you could tell, we took a very concrete and specific approach, as we do in everything, in trying to really operationalize this stuff in policy. So on behalf of your guys' agencies, what are your concrete next steps to make sure that our shared priorities, as outlined in this report, and other equity priorities, are acted on? So I'm gonna start with Carrie this time.
Yeah, that's a great question. So as I mentioned, the thing I think I most love about this report is just how concrete and actionable it is. And as I mentioned before, at EdTrust, we're really fortunate. We partner with these amazing advocates all across the country who, as Tommy was just talking about, really know their communities and know their community needs and challenges. And so we are going to put this report in the hands of those advocates so that they can use this as a tool in the ways that they know will work best in their states, using these very concrete recommendations. And I also think this gives us a toolbox to get at equity and early learning all different ways. I think sometimes we're looking for a hammer, but I think other times we really need to like pepper in these recommendations in every single way we can, all over agencies and within different legislation, rather than just trying to have one big thing. And so this creates this menu of options to get at equity at all different angles at all different levels of government. So that's exciting for us.
Let's go to Jennifer.
Thank you. One of the things that I really pulled from this is that we will be able to use every single day is first the concrete steps that everybody said, but also how we can reach out and what should that communication and conversation look like. And I think Tommy hit it for me, and it said that this is everybody's responsibility, and to be able to take a look at this conversation from that perspective, that is so important. One of the sort of very specific things that we are already doing is connecting particularly state leaders, national leaders, with communities that need to hear from them. And that, being able to use a resource like this kind of helps bridge that conversation and communication. And one of the other things that the tribal communities really have a big challenge of is how we even understand and know what's happening in our communities. Data is such an impossible thing for us to get access to. And I'm really excited that this was highlighted so heavily in this work, because it's something that we have to have in order to understand what's even happening in our communities. I will be sharing this with our policy friends, as well as communities across the country, that really focus on what information we need to know about tribal communities. We just got access to tribal plans to better understand what tribal communities are doing. And we've been trying to get these for the whole time I've been with NICA, which is nearly a decade. We just got them, and this is the first step that we can take in better understanding how tribal communities are serving their children and how we can better engage with our states and with the sort of more national landscape. So I'm really excited to have this as a tool in my resource box for sharing this conversation. And I appreciate everybody's efforts on it. Thank you.
Dr. Moore, you want to jump in?
Yeah, Chantel, just like you had your conversation with Tommy and Lauren, you and I have been talking for some time about these important issues. And so at the council, we really want equity to be grounded in everything we do. And, we're going to be partnering with you to make sure that happens. And so we're excited about this opportunity because my other thought is around this notion that, how do you know when you get there? And I think having this report helps us make sure that we'll know when we get there. And I love the idea that we're on a journey and that we are headed somewhere. That I think Tommy said equity was the vehicle, right, Tommy? And I think that's really important. But I think this report, the way it's articulated, lets us know when we get there.
Lauren, do you want to jump in next?
Yeah, I love Dr. Moore's point on the question of accountability, right? It helps us give a guide and a check on ourselves and on each other. And, I think this idea for concrete next steps, I think, this idea that it really needs to be integrated and elevated, right? It needs to be built into everything we're doing in terms of our state and federal policy recommendations, pushing on the inclusion of racial equity in everything from professional standards and competencies, and making explicit the connection between financing, which we got to do financing, and the investment in the education and compensation of the workforce as solutions, frankly, that are being raised to questions about supply of childcare, which the pandemic has only sort of worsened. I would just say finally to Dr. James's point about this moment of implementation that I think is such a crucial point. There is an element of this that's about, from concrete standpoint, like addressing the literal logistics of inclusion, like time and money and support, and making a habit of all of us sort of looking around and saying like, okay, and I think this is, Dawn's point earlier too, are our tribal communities here as we're making these decisions? What about our family childcare providers? Are our Spanish speaker providers here? If not, what do we need to do to make that happen? And I think there's a point that Portia made at some point in the chat, I think she had to jump off, but is philanthropy oriented towards supporting that work as well? And is there a way that we're thinking about how all of these pieces fit together to really make these elements real?
Dr. James, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I absolutely echo funding. It was the first thing that I took down in my notes, sharing these points with our affiliates as well. And also MBCDI, our primary policy areas are related to the workforce. We have a joint brief that we just completed with Unidos US about how we support Black and Latinx educators through the pandemic. And through the recovery. And then I have one that's kind of interpersonal for all of us that I'd like to challenge us all to, related to next steps. And one is building our knowledge. So don't kind of never thinking that we know enough about racial equity, but continue to build our knowledge. And this is something that's been a personal journey for me. The second is like being comfortable in conversations. Building your knowledge, but then knowing how to talk to others about it, because it's through these conversations and it's through individual thinking and changing individual thinking that we really make progress. It's one drop in the bucket at a time, and with that, we can get to that point where we're effective in changing systems and really thinking about all of us putting the onus on us in our individual actions to change systems, whether that's creating a brown bag at your job, saying, you know what, we need to have a brown bag lunch every other week where we talk about race, where we talk about equity. There are just small things that we can do that may not feel like systemic changes, but if you're a hiring manager, ensuring that during orientation or even in your hiring practices that you're thinking about equity, that you're thinking about ensuring that we're bringing people into this field and training people in a way that advances their knowledge of equity. So I think there's also some personal work that we all have to commit to in order to make ourselves more effective in changing systems.
And Tommy, you want to jump in?
I love that last point. That was my first thing as well on here, is that I think, the concrete steps, number one, is we have to look internally. What are we doing in our organizations? What are we doing in our own lives? What more can we be doing as a community, as individual programs in that space? And I think that is so critical. I'll just tell you too, a couple other things that we are already working on. Number one is incorporating this into our policy agenda. It is that season where all of us look at our policy agendas, and I can already say it was so helpful that we had this final report right as we're about to get it finalized, because we said, okay, what did we get? Okay, we got this, we got this, we got this. What else can we put in? So we've incorporated a lot of those things. And then the last thing, and I see Deborah Fitzgerald raised this point in the chat, which I couldn't agree more with, is funding. It's going to be a tough go at funding these next few years. It is going to be so difficult on the federal level, but it is critical. We are not going to be able to do this work without it. And we all are going to have to be echoing the same voice, the same statement to be able to get some of these things done. And I think now that we have a reason to talk about why the funding would be important, it's going to be up to all of us to do that. And that is something I know NHSA will absolutely commit to, as many of you, I know we work very closely to do the funding things as well. And thank you.
Thank you all so much. We're about out of time, so I'm going to close us out. Thank you just immensely to all of our partners and to all of our co-authors who worked on this paper. Ultimately, the paper is only as good as how it's used, right? We don't want this to sit on a shelf. The point was really to use it for implementation, to use it to have a shared agenda, to have it to be, at the top of our priority list. We say that equity is often a priority, but we don't always act on it that way. When we meet with anyone on the Hill, is this the first thing we talk about? When we give talks, is this the first thing we say? When we publish reports or when we do TA, is this the first thing we address? Or does it fall down, or does it get siloed, or does it get sidetracked? This really, in practice, has to be a priority for all of us, not just in talk. So with that, I would invite you to download the full report. The website and the link is there. Follow all of us on social media. I know our program manager, Janiko Dockwins, who this would also not be possible without, share those links on the website, and reach out to us if you want to partner, if you want to work together to disseminate and to implement. We will partner with anyone who wants to partner with us. So with that, thank you again to our co-authors, to our partners. We look forward to making this a reality for all of us. So with that, have a great day. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Chantal.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Martine, as well.
Yes, big shout out to Martin.
Yes, Martine.
Thank you, Chantal.